The air on that October morning in 1979 had the sharp, metallic bite of an ending. It was the kind of cold that went straight through a denim jacket and settled deep in your bones, a cold that promised a hard winter was on its way. Dawn was just a faint, grey smear on the eastern horizon, backlighting the skeletal arms of the oak trees lining Jed Miller's lane. We stood in a silent cluster in his farmyard, maybe 50 of us, our breath pluming in the frigid air like ghosts. Farmers, neighbours, bankers, and vultures, all drawn to the death of a farm. Jed's place was going under the hammer. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man from the city with a voice like gravel in a tin can, was setting up his podium on the back of a flatbed truck. The bank president, Mr. Abernathy, stood beside him, looking smug and impatient in a wool overcoat that probably cost more than my first tractor. They weren't here for the community. They were here to liquidate a life, to turn 60 years of Miller sweat and toil into columns on a ledger. I'm Arthur Callahan. Most folks just call me Art. I wasn't there to bid on the big stuff. I farmed the 240 acres my father had farmed, and his father before him. I did it with a John Deere 40-20 I'd bought used in '68, and a collection of implements that were all paid for in cash. I didn't owe the bank a dime, and I intended to keep it that way. I was there out of respect for Jed, and to maybe pick up a wrench set or a log chain if the price was right. You never have enough log chains. Then Richard Sterling rolled in. He didn't drive, he made an entrance. His brand new Ford F-250, a gleaming monument of chrome and candy apple red, crunched up the gravel lane, its headlights cutting through the gloom. He swung out of the cab, a man barely 30, with a cocky grin and eyes that were always calculating angles. He was the new king of the county, buying up land with the bank's money like it was a game. He saw farming not as a way of life, but as a high-stakes poker match, and with land prices and corn futures soaring, he was holding a royal flush. He saw me standing by the machine shed and sauntered over, his fancy cowboy boots slipping a little on the frozen mud. "Morning, Art," he said, his voice dripping with false friendliness. "Come to see the future of farming." I just nodded, my hands deep in my pockets. "Came to pay my respects to Jed." Sterling chuckled, a short, ugly sound. Respect doesn't pay the bills. Jed couldn't adapt. He was running junk, just like... He let his eyes wander over to my 10-year-old Chevy pickup, rust creeping up from the wheel wells. He didn't have to finish the sentence. We both knew he was talking about me. The auction started with the land. Abernathy from the bank gave a little speech about opportunity and progress, words that tasted like ash in my mouth. The bidding was fast and brutal. Sterling, with Abernathy nodding encouragement at his shoulder, bought all 160 acres of Jed's prime bottom ground. Just like that, the Miller farm was gone, absorbed into the growing Sterling empire. Then came the equipment. Sterling paid top dollar for Jed's newest tractor, a well-kept International 1066 with low hours. He bought the planter, the disc, the whole modern line. The pile of old iron, the stuff Jed had kept running for decades, was pushed to the side. Finally, the auctioneer pointed to the last major piece, sitting forlornly at the back of the lot. It was Jed's combine, a Massey Ferguson 510, probably a 69 or 70. Its red paint was faded to a dull, sun-bleached pink. There were streaks of rust running down from the bolts, and the tires were checked with age. It was a conventional straw walker machine in an age when everyone was drooling over the new rotary combines. "All right, folks, what am I bid for this classic piece of harvesting history?" the auctioneer barked, trying to inject some enthusiasm into the crowd. A stony silence fell. A few guys snickered. Sterling laughed out loud. "You'd be better off selling that thing for scrap," he called out. The auctioneer ignored him. "Do I hear $500? $500 to start it off?" Crickets. The machine was an orphan. Nobody wanted the headache. It was too small, too slow, too old. But I walked over to it. I ran my hand along the cold sheet metal of the grain head. I knew these machines. I'd worked on a neighbor's 410 model back when I was a kid. I peered underneath, my eyes tracing the heavy chains and belts. I looked at the Perkins diesel engine, tucked away in its compartment. It was dusty, but there were no major leaks. The battery cables were sound. I knew Jed. He might have been short on cash, but he wasn't short on maintenance. He took care of his iron. This combine wasn't junk. It was just forgotten. $300, I said, my voice clear and steady in the quiet yard. The auctioneer's head snapped in my direction, surprised. "I got 300 from Art Callahan. Do I hear 4? Sterling shot me a look, a mixture of pity and contempt. Then a cruel little smile played on his lips. 400, he said, not even looking at the combine. He was looking right at me. He wasn't bidding on the machine. He was bidding against me. It was a power play, a public humiliation. He wanted to prove that he could take anything he wanted, even a piece of scrap I'd shown an interest in. 450, I said, my jaw tight. 500, Sterling shot back instantly. The crowd was watching now, a quiet drama unfolding in the cold morning air. This wasn't about a combine anymore. This was about two different ways of looking at the world. His way, built on credit and conquest, and my way, built on calloused hands and paid in full receipts. 600, I said. That was the cash I had in my wallet for the month's groceries. Sterling laughed again. 7. I hesitated. My wife, Martha, would have my hide. But I looked at that old Massey, and I saw more than rust and faded paint. I saw independence. I saw a harvest brought in without a payment book hanging over my head. I saw a way to stay free. $1,000, I said. My voice didn't waver. A murmur went through the crowd. Sterling's smile faltered for a second. He hadn't expected me to go that high. He looked at the combine, then back at me. He saw the look in my eyes. He was a gambler, and he knew when a man was all in. Shaking his head with a dismissive smirk, he waved his hand. He can have the damn thing. Let the old man play with his toys. The auctioneer's gavel cracked like a rifle shot. Sold for $1,000 to Art Callahan. The weight of it settled on me as I walked over to pay the clerk. I'd just spent a fortune on another man's problems. As I handed over the wad of cash, I could feel Sterling's eyes on my back, and I could hear the whispers starting among the neighbors. Art Callahan, the man who refused to take out a loan for a new tractor, had just thrown $1,000 away on Jed Miller's old junker. Before we go any further, I gotta ask you folks listening, have you ever bought something old that everyone else called junk, just because you knew you could bring it back to life? Let me know down in the comments what it was. A tractor, a truck, an old tool. I read everyone. Getting that Massey Ferguson home was an ordeal in itself. It hadn't been started in months, and the batteries were flatter than a pancake. I had to use the heavy-duty jumper cables from my service truck, hooking them to the big diesel battery and letting my truck's alternator charge it for a good 20 minutes. Finally, with a puff of black smoke and a clatter that sounded like a skeleton falling down a flight of stairs, the Perkins diesel roared to life. It settled into a rough, uneven idle, but it was running. The 13-mile drive home was a slow, rattling procession. The combine's top road speed was maybe 12 miles an hour, downhill with a tailwind. I had the grain head on its transport trailer, towed behind, but the machine itself was wide and clumsy. Every car that came up behind me had to slow to a crawl before swerving around me, the drivers giving me looks that ranged from curiosity to outright annoyance. Halfway home, Rich Sterling blew past me in his shiny Ford, laying on the horn in a long, mocking blast as he disappeared over the next hill. I just gripped the steering wheel tighter and kept my eyes on the road. I finally lumbered into my own farmyard as the sun was getting high, the old combine groaning and creaking its way into the machine shed. The shed was my sanctuary. It was built by my grandfather, with massive oak beams and a dirt floor that had been soaked with so much used motor oil over the years, it was as hard as concrete. It smelled of grease, steel, and honest work. Martha came out of the house, wiping her hands on her apron, a worried look on her face. "Arthur, what in heaven's name did you do?" "I bought a combine, Martha," I said, shutting down the rumbling diesel. The sudden silence was deafening. "You spent $1,000 on that thing?" she asked, her voice quiet. She wasn't angry, just concerned. $1,000 was a lot of money to us. It was seed money. It was a new roof for the barn. "It's paid for," I said simply, "and it's going to get our crop in." She looked at me, then at the machine, and just sighed. "Well, I hope you know what you're doing." So did I. For the next 2 months, that machine shed was my whole world. I didn't just plan to fix the Massey, I planned to resurrect it. I started with the heart of the beast, the Perkins 3Y54 diesel. I drained the sludgy black oil and the stale, algae-filled diesel fuel. I pulled every fuel line and blew it out with compressed air. I took the injectors out, brought them to my workbench, and carefully disassembled them, cleaning the tiny nozzles with a brass brush until they were spotless. I spent an entire afternoon meticulously setting the valve lash, feeling for that perfect, minute gap with a feeler gauge, knowing that proper breathing was everything to a diesel engine. Next, I turned my attention to the guts of the combine. The variable speed drive is the transmission of a machine like this, a massive belt and 2 pulleys that change diameter to alter the ground speed. The main belt was riddled with cracks, ready to fly apart under load. I had to drive into town to the Massey dealer to order a new one. Old man Hemlock, who ran the parts counter, peered at me over his glasses. "A V-belt for a 510? Haven't sold one of those in years, Art. You sure you don't want to just put that thing out to pasture?" "Just order the belt, Henry," I said. While I waited for the part, I climbed deep inside the machine's belly. It was a dark, claustrophobic world of chains, sprockets, and sharp metal edges. I checked the rasp bars on the main threshing cylinder, running my fingers over them to feel for wear. I inspected the concave, the grate the cylinder beats the grain through, making sure it wasn't bent or plugged. I spent a whole day on my back, sliding the straw walkers out one by one. These were the long, oscillating wooden frames that shake the straw to separate the last bits of grain. I found a hairline crack in one of them, so I reinforced it with a piece of angle iron and a set of carriage bolts, a repair that was stronger than the original. The worst job was a main bearing on the cleaning fan. It had a telltale grumble when I spun it by hand. Getting to it required removing half the sheet metal on the right side of the machine. The old bearing was seized onto the shaft. I fought it for hours with heat from a torch and a gear puller that groaned under the strain. Finally, with a screech of protesting metal, it came free. I carefully cleaned the shaft with emery cloth, packed the new bearing with high-temperature grease, and used a piece of pipe and a 3-pound hammer to gently, painstakingly tap it into place. The clean, solid thud as it seated home was one of the most satisfying sounds in the world. By the time spring planting came around, the talk at the co-op coffee shop was predictable. Rich Sterling had just traded for a new international 12-row planter. He was putting his crop in with terrifying efficiency, his big 2+2 tractor making perfect straight lines across the hundreds of new acres he was farming. He was the talk of the town, the very model of modern agriculture. Meanwhile, word had gotten around about my winter project. The consensus was that I'd finally lost my mind. Poor Art, they'd say, shaking their heads. Too stubborn to take a loan, so he's trying to farm with museum pieces. I ignored them. I was out in my fields with my old John Deere 4220 and my 6-row 7000 planter, plugging away at my own pace. A late spring rain made my fields a little muddier than Sterling's well-drained bottom ground, so I got started a week later than he did. He'd drive by on the gravel road, slowing his big pickup just enough to watch me for a minute, a smug look on his face, before speeding off in a cloud of dust. It was hard not to feel small. It was hard not to feel like I was being left behind. But every night, I'd come home, tired and sore, and I'd look at my account book. No new entries in the debt column. And that, to me, was everything. The next few years were a strange time to be a farmer. It was the tail end of the 70s, and the world felt like it was spinning faster every day. The price of corn went up, the price of soybeans went up, and the price of land went through the roof. The news on the television was all doom and gloom, inflation, gas lines, hostages in Iran. But out here in the heartland, it felt like a gold rush. The banks were handing out money like it was candy at a parade. The prevailing wisdom, preached from the pages of every farm magazine and spouted by every fast-talking lender, was simple. Get big or get out. Expand your acreage, modernize your equipment, leverage your assets. Debt was no longer a dirty word. It was a tool. It was the key to prosperity. Rich Sterling didn't just drink the Kool-Aid, he swam in it. He used the newly inflated value of the old Miller place as collateral to buy another 200-acre farm that came up for sale down the road. He built a massive grain drying and storage system, 2 gleaming silver bins that towered over his farmstead, all of it financed. He traded in the 1066 he'd bought at Jed's auction for a brand new, top-of-the-line international harvester, 3588, one of those strange-looking 2-plow-2 articulated tractors with the cab stuck out in the middle. It was a beast of a machine, and he made sure everyone saw him driving it. The local paper even did a story on him. The face of modern farming, with a big picture of him leaning against the front tire of that new tractor, grinning like he'd just won the lottery. And in a way, he had. On paper, with his land values skyrocketing, he was a millionaire several times over. I just kept my head down. I watched the interest rates on the nightly news with a growing sense of dread. The Federal Reserve, under a man named Paul Volcker, was jacking them up to fight inflation. 10%, 12, 15. The numbers were staggering, but they seemed disconnected from the frenzy happening around me. I kept farming my 240 acres. I paid my property taxes, bought my seed and fertilizer with cash from the previous year's crop, and put whatever was left in the bank. I was a rowboat in an ocean of battleships, and everyone saw me as a fool, a relic from a bygone era who was too scared to take a risk. The first harvest with the old Massey was a trial by fire. It was a good year, with heavy yields, and the machine was slow. It didn't have the capacity of the new combines. I could only run about 2.5 miles an hour in my best corn. Sterling, who had traded up again to a massive new Gleaner N6 rotary combine, was finishing up his harvesting, just as I was getting started on my last 80 acres. He drove by one afternoon, and stopped his truck at the end of the field. He leaned out the window. "Still running that museum piece, Art?" he yelled over the noise of the engine. "At this rate, you'll be harvesting till Christmas." He laughed and drove off. He was almost right. A week later, in the middle of the night, trying to beat a coming rainstorm, I heard a loud bang and a terrible grinding noise from the guts of the combine. I shut everything down, my heart sinking. I climbed up with a flashlight and found the main chain for the clean grain elevator had snapped and wadded itself up around the bottom sprocket. There was nothing to do but fix it. I spent the next 4 hours working by the headlights of my pickup truck in the cold and the dark. My knuckles were skinned raw from wrestling with the heavy, greasy chain. I had to use a bolt cutter to get the mangled section out and a chain breaker to piece in a new length. By the time I was done, a cold, miserable drizzle had started to fall, and I was soaked to the bone and shivering. But I got it done. I fired the machine back up, and the familiar, rumbling rhythm of the elevator told me the repair had held. I finished the field just as the real rain began to fall. That winter, the winter of '79, the ground froze hard and early. I spent my days in the machine shed, getting my planter ready for spring, grinding the rust off the disc openers, replacing worn bearings. I had the radio on for company, tuned to the station out of Des Moines. The news was getting worse. The Soviets had invaded Afghanistan, and in response, President Carter had announced a grain embargo. The market, which had been our best friend for years, plummeted overnight. The foundation of the entire farm economy had cracked. One afternoon, the announcer's voice cut through the drone of my bench grinder. He was talking about the prime interest rate. It had just hit 18%. He said some economists were predicting it could go to 20, even 21%. I shut the grinder off. The silence in the shed was heavy. 18%. I tried to imagine paying that kind of interest on a loan for a new tractor, for a farm, for a grain bin. It was impossible. It was financial suicide. I walked to the big sliding door and looked out across my snow-covered fields, stark and white under a steel-grey sky. A cold fear, colder than the wind whistling through the cracks in the old barn wood, settled in my gut. I thought of Rich Sterling, with his hundreds of acres, his new iron, his towering grain bins, all of it bought with the bank's money, all of it mortgaged to the hilt based on the promise of high prices and cheap credit. Both of those promises had just been broken. I didn't feel any satisfaction. I didn't feel any vindication. I just felt a profound and terrible sadness. A storm was coming, a financial hurricane, the likes of which none of us had ever seen. And I knew that for all his shiny new equipment and all his confidence, Rich Sterling was standing right in the middle of the path. The spring of 1980 arrived late and mean. The rains that should have softened the black earth for planting never came. Instead, a hot, dry wind blew in from the southwest, a constant, scouring presence that picked up the topsoil from our fields and hazed the sky into a perpetual, dusty brown. By June, the young corn, which should have been knee-high and a vibrant, waxy green, was stunted and pale, its leaves rolled tight as cigars to conserve what little moisture it could find. The whole county held its breath, praying for a storm that never materialized. The drought was an impartial enemy. It punished us all. My own crops looked just as pitiful as everyone else's. But the drought exposed a deeper sickness. For men like Rich Sterling, who were leveraged to the absolute limit, a bad crop wasn't just a disappointment, it was a catastrophe. His massive loan payments were calculated on the expectation of 150 bushel corn. The way things were looking, he'd be lucky to get 70. I first saw the real cracks in his empire one blistering afternoon in July. I was cultivating my soybeans, kicking up clouds of fine dust with my old International cultivator, when I saw Sterling's big 2-plow-2 tractor stopped dead in the middle of his field, right across the road. The sheer size of it dwarfed my own outfit. He was pulling a 24-foot field cultivator, an implement that would have choked my 40-20 to death. But the giant machine was silent. I watched for a while as Sterling climbed in and out of the cab, his movements frantic. After half an hour, he slammed the cab door and kicked one of the massive dual tires, a gesture of pure, helpless rage. Later that evening, I saw the dealer's service truck parked in his lane. It was there the next day, too. The talk at the co-op was that the transmission's electronic control module had fried. It was a $50 circuit board, buried under $3,000 of labor to get to it, and the part was on back order from the factory in Illinois. For 10 crucial days, as the weeds in his fields exploded in the heat, Sterling's $250,000 tractor was nothing more than an oversized lawn ornament. He had all the horsepower in the world, but it was held hostage by a piece of technology no bigger than a deck of cards. My old 4020, with its simple gear-driven transmission and mechanical linkages, just kept running. It wasn't fast, it wasn't comfortable, but it was honest. If something broke, I knew it would be a belt, a bearing, or a hose, something I could see, touch, and fix myself with the tools in my own shed. The harvest that fall was a grim, dusty affair. The yields were as bad as we'd feared. My old Massey 510 clattered through the thin stands of corn without breaking a sweat. It had been designed for the crops of the 1960s, and this drought-stunted harvest was well within its capacity. I brought in my crop, what there was of it, and put it in my old wooden cribs. It wasn't much, but my costs had been low. I knew I could weather it. Sterling was in a different world of trouble. He finally got his big tractor fixed, but the bill was enormous. Then, in the middle of soybean harvest, his new Gleaner combine developed a catastrophic hydraulic leak in the main pump that controlled the header and reel. It was another complex, expensive repair that put him days behind schedule. He had to hire a custom harvester to finish, another expense he couldn't afford. He had bought into a system that promised ultimate efficiency, but that efficiency was fragile. It depended on everything working perfectly, on cheap fuel, on easy credit, and on forgiving weather. That year, all of those things had vanished. The first real sign of his desperation came a week after the harvest. He pulled into my lane in his Ford pickup, the candy apple red paint now coated in a film of dust. He didn't get out right away, just sat there with the engine running. I walked out to see what he wanted. He rolled down the window, avoiding my eyes. "Art," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual bravado. I need to move some grain around. My main auger motor burned out." He paused. "I was wondering if I could borrow your 8-inch auger for a day or two." It was a small thing, but it was everything. He was asking to borrow my 30-year-old PTO-driven auger, a simple, clanking machine I'd bought at a farm sale for $100. He had a state-of-the-art grain system with leg elevators and digital moisture sensors, but it was useless because one part had failed. I looked at this man, who had publicly mocked my old equipment, now asking to borrow a piece of it to save himself. There was no triumph in it for me. I just saw a young farmer trapped in a corner. "Sure, Rich," I said. "It's back behind the machine shed. Just bring it back when you're done." He nodded, a flicker of relief in his eyes. "I appreciate it." He started to put the truck in gear, then stopped. "That old combine of yours," he said, looking over at the Massey sitting in the shed. "It got your crop in, didn't it?" "It did," I said. He just shook his head slowly, as if seeing it for the first time, and drove away. The turning point wasn't a single event. It was a slow, grinding realization, like two massive gears that had been turning against each other for years, finally beginning to shift. The world he had built on paper was crumbling under the hard reality of dirt, weather, and cold, hard cash. The winter that followed was the quietest I can ever remember. It was the quiet of fear. The price of land, which had been the bedrock of everyone's net worth, began to slide. At first it was a little, then a lot. Farms that had been appraised at $3,000 an acre were struggling to find buyers at $2,000, then $1,500. For farmers like Sterling, who had borrowed against that inflated value, it was a death spiral. Their collateral was evaporating, but the debt remained, cold and unmoving, accruing interest at a terrifying 21%. The foreclosure notices started appearing in the county paper in the spring of '82. At first, it was just one or two on the back page. By the following year, they had their own section. It was like reading the obituaries of families we'd known our whole lives. The names changed, but the story was always the same. Too much debt, taken on in the good times, had become an anchor that was now pulling them under in the bad. Mr. Abernathy, the banker who had once stood so proudly beside Sterling, was no longer a welcome guest at the coffee shop. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a year, his expensive suits seeming to hang off his shrinking frame. The same system that had made him a kingmaker was now forcing him to be an undertaker, and the weight of it was crushing him. I saw Rich Sterling and his wife, Sarah, at the grocery store one Tuesday. They looked haunted. Sarah's eyes were red-rimmed, and Rich had lost the confident swagger that had been his trademark. He looked stooped, older than his years. They were buying the basics: flour, potatoes, ground beef, a stark contrast to the overflowing carts they used to push through the aisles. We nodded to each other, a quiet, somber acknowledgement of the storm that was raging. There was no room for, "I told you so." There was only a shared sense of tragedy. The inevitable notice appeared in the paper in September of 1983. A public auction to be held at the Sterling farmstead to satisfy debts owed to the county bank. All chattel and property, including 520 acres of prime farmland, would be sold to the highest bidder. It was Jed Miller's story all over again, but on a scale that was hard to comprehend. The day of the auction was a mirror image of Jed's, yet entirely different. It was another cold, grey morning, but the mood was not one of predatory excitement. It was a funeral. The crowd was larger, but quieter. We were all there, farmers from all over the county, but no one was smiling. We were all thinking the same thing: there but for the grace of God go I. Sterling's equipment was lined up in perfect gleaming rows: the giant 3588 tractor, the Gleaner N6 combine, its paint still shiny, the massive planters and tillage tools. It looked like a dealer's lot, a testament to a dream of industrial-scale farming. But now it was just collateral, assets to be liquidated. Rich and Sarah stood on the porch of their house, the house they were about to lose. Sarah was holding their young son's hand, her face a mask of grief. Rich just stared out at the crowd, his face blank, as if he were watching a movie of someone else's life. He caught my eye for a moment, and in his gaze I saw the full weight of his defeat. He wasn't the arrogant gambler anymore. He was just a man who had lost everything. Abernathy got up on the auctioneer's flatbed, but he didn't give a speech about progress this time. He just looked out at us, his face haggard, and mumbled a few words about the bank's legal obligations before turning the microphone over. The bidding was sluggish, heartbreaking. The big, new equipment sold for pennies on the dollar. There was no easy credit anymore. The only bidders were those with cash, and there were precious few of us left. A four-wheel drive tractor that Sterling had paid over $100,000 for sold for $30. The giant combine, his pride and joy, barely brought $25. I watched as his net worth, his entire future, was dismantled piece by piece in the space of 2 hours. Then came the land. The auctioneer started with the 200-acre parcel Sterling had bought last. It sold for a pittance, barely a third of what he had paid for it just a few years earlier. Finally, the auctioneer announced the last parcel. And now, folks, the home 160 acres, the original Miller farm. A hush fell over the crowd. This was the piece of ground that had started it all. I looked at the land, rolling gently down to the creek bottom. It was good land, land that had been cared for by the Miller family for generations before Sterling ever set foot on it. Land that deserved a caretaker, not a speculator. For 4 years, while others had been sinking deeper into debt, I had been saving. Martha and I lived simply. We didn't take fancy vacations. We didn't buy new pickups. Every dollar we earned that wasn't spent on seed, fuel, or food went into a savings account at the credit union in the next town over. I had been watching land prices fall, waiting for this moment. Not for this specific farm, but for an opportunity to secure my family's future, to ensure my own son would have something to build on if he chose this life. The auctioneer started the bidding low. A few bottom feeders, investors from the city, threw out some numbers. The price crept up slowly, painfully. It stalled at a number that was shockingly low, but still more than most farmers there could afford. "Do I hear another bid?" the auctioneer called out, his voice echoing in the cold air. "Going once, going twice." I took a deep breath. I looked at Martha, who was standing beside me. She saw the look in my eye and gave me a small, firm nod. She knew. She understood. "I bid $160,000, I said. My voice was clear and steady. It carried across the silent farmyard. Every head turned in my direction. Sterling, standing on the porch, looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. Abernathy, who had been staring at his shoes, snapped his head up. The auctioneer squinted, trying to place who had spoken. "A bid of $160 from Art Callahan." The investors huddled together, whispering, then shook their heads. They were done. For them it was just numbers on a page. For me, it was something more. "Going once," the auctioneer called, his eyes on me. "Going twice." He looked around the crowd one last time. "Sold for $160,000 to Art Callahan." The crack of the gavel sealed it. A quiet murmur went through the crowd. I hadn't just bought a farm. I had bought back a piece of our community's soul. I walked to the clerk's table and wrote out a check for the full amount, draining the account I had so patiently filled. As I signed my name, I felt not the thrill of victory, but the solemn weight of responsibility. After the auction was over and the crowd began to disperse, I walked over to the porch where Rich and Sarah were still standing, looking lost. I stopped at the bottom of the steps. "Rich," I said quietly. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a confusing mix of shame, resentment, and a sliver of gratitude. "You got what you wanted, Art. You got to see me lose it all." "That's not what I wanted," I said, my voice even. "I wanted to see this land in the hands of a farmer. It's good land. It deserves to be farmed right." I hesitated, then made the offer that had been forming in my mind all morning. "The house and the buildings are on this parcel. You know them better than anyone. I'll need someone to look after the place, and I'll need help getting the crop in next year. I'll rent the house to you for a price you can afford, and I'll pay you a fair wage for your work, if you're willing." Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Rich stared at me, speechless. He had expected vengeance, or at least smug satisfaction. He was being offered a chance. Not a handout, but a chance to work, to provide for his family, to stay in the only home his son had ever known. Tears welled in his eyes, the first real emotion I had seen from him all day. He swallowed hard, the pride he had left warring with the desperation he couldn't hide. Finally, he just nodded, unable to speak. That was enough. I turned and walked back to my truck, leaving them to absorb the wreckage and the single plank of rescue I had offered. The years that followed were a time of slow healing for our community and for the land itself. Rich Sterling worked for me for 5 years. He was a changed man. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet competence. He knew how to work, and he worked hard. He learned from me, not just about fixing old machinery, but about the rhythm of a farm that lives within its means. I taught him how to listen to an engine, to tell by the sound if it was happy or strained. I taught him how to weld a clean bead, how to rebuild a hydraulic cylinder, how to make a part instead of buying one. In return, he taught me about new hybrid seeds and more modern approaches to soil conservation. We weren't friends, not in the easy way, but a deep, unspoken respect grew between us. After 5 years, he had saved enough to put a down payment on a small 80-acre farm on the other side of the county. He bought it at a fair price, with a sensible loan. He bought used, reliable equipment, paying cash for most of it. The day he and his family moved, he came to my workshop to say goodbye. He shook my hand, his grip firm. "Thank you, Art," he said. "You didn't just give me a job. You taught me how to be a farmer." My own son, Tom, grew up and decided the farm was the life for him. He had my hands, the kind that understood machinery. I taught him everything my father had taught me, and everything I had learned on my own. I taught him that debt is a tool, but a dangerous one like a chainsaw. Used carefully for the right job, it can be helpful. Used recklessly, it will take a limb, or your whole life. He's farming with me now. We still run the old 4020. It's been overhauled twice, but it's as strong as ever. And in the back of the main shed, under a heavy canvas tarp, sits the Massey Ferguson 510 combine. We haven't used it in years. We have a slightly newer, bigger machine now, a used John Deere 6X60 from the late 80s that we paid for with cash. But I could never bring myself to sell the old Massey. Sometimes on a quiet autumn evening, I'll pull the tarp off and just look at it. The red paint is almost completely gone now, faded to a soft, rusty orange. But I don't see a piece of junk. I see the $1,000 bet I made on myself. I see the nights spent with greasy hands and a flashlight, the satisfaction of a repair done right. I see the machine that kept us free when the world was falling apart. Tom came out to the shed the other day and saw me looking at it. "You gonna get rid of that old thing someday, Dad?" I ran my hand over the cool, dusty metal of the grain head. I looked out past the open doors of the shed, across the 400 acres that were ours, free and clear. I could see the lights on in the house, on the old Miller place, where a good young family now lived. I thought of Rich Sterling, farming his own ground again, his kids growing up with dirt under their fingernails. "No, son," I said, a smile touching my lips. "I don't think so. That old thing isn't just a combine, it's the family savings account.